Hello and welcome to On Liberty, coming to you live from the Centre for Independent Studies here in Sydney. I'm Glenn Fay, your host for today's episode, filling in for our regular host Salvatore Babonis, who will be back soon. Joining me on today's episode is Simon Breheny. Simon is Public Policy Manager at Philip Morris International, and he's the former Policy Director at the Institute of Public Affairs. Simon, thanks for joining us.
G'day, Glenn. Great to be with you.
Simon, to kick us off, what is harm reduction and why is it something that is important to the work that you do?
Well, the concept of harm reduction is one to do with accepting people and taking people as they are, recognising that you might want for people to behave in a certain way and you might want for them to do certain things and refrain from doing things, but tobacco harm reduction and harm reduction as a concept takes people as they are and accepts that while we might not think that drinking is a great idea or smoking is a great idea, there are people that continue to smoke and continue to drink and continue to do other things that are potentially harmful. And so the question is, are there ways for them to do that in a way that's less harmful? And so one of the big focuses for me is on telling people about what it is that we can do when it comes to specifically tobacco harm reduction.
Mm. And so when we talk about harm reduction, what in related to tobacco, what are the sort of activities we're talking about here?
Well, conceptually, what we're talking about is a couple of things. To achieve population-wide harm reduction, you need two factors. One, you need products that deliver what it is that smokers are looking for in a less harmful way. You need to make sure that that product is scientifically substantiated so that we can show that, yes, it is, based on the evidence, a less harmful product. And two, you need uptake amongst current adult smokers. So those are the two things that you need. You can have a great product that has no uptake at all. And if you do that, then you won't achieve anything in terms of population-wide harm reduction. And those are the two things that I think we really ought to focus on. The important thing, of course, and where a lot of the controversy comes around is to do with what cohort of people are taking up some of these products. So when you talk about reduced harm or reduced risk, you're not talking about zero risk. So it's really important that the cohort of people we're talking about are current adult smokers who are switching to these less harmful alternatives.
Well, aren't we just accepting then that rather than trying to solve a problem like alcohol, tobacco use, are we saying that it's just too complex to solve that problem, and we've now taken a second best option?
No, I think in many ways it's actually the best possible option because while we've had significant tax increases, we've had in Australia plain packaging, we've had a whole range of other restrictions placed on the sale of combustible tobacco products. We haven't, until the last sort of 20 years or so, had a product that people could switch to which was still going to satisfy some of the things that they're looking for. It still contains nicotine. We're talking here about e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products and other products that deliver nicotine in a less harmful way without combustion. And two, we're seeing uptake amongst a group of people who may not have quit smoking. So that's the thing that I think is really important, to understand that you're going to continue having a group of people who will quit smoking. That's great, but then what are we going to do for the people who will continue to smoke? And the World Health Organization estimates that there are around 1 billion people who smoke today around the world. There will continue to be around 1 billion people who will continue to smoke even up until 2025. So I think the question really is, with all of those regulatory restrictions that we've placed on the product, is there something that can complement that when it comes to people choosing to take on to consume nicotine in a less harmful way?
Does it almost amount to policymakers kind of playing God though? Or are you sort of saying that, well, these people don't, are you can say either that not everyone should be protected from any harm that may come their way, but then are you not also then saying that, well, we can identify which ones that is not going to work for, and this population of people whom that other approach, that maybe traditional approach on regulation, may work? How do you make that call about where to cut off?
Well, we put it we have what we call a triplet. So what we say is, if you don't smoke, you shouldn't start. If you do smoke, you should quit. But if you don't quit, then what are we going to do for that cohort of people? So that's really the cohort of people that we're talking about when we talk about tobacco harm reduction and some of these tools now that are available, some of these technologies that are available. And I think that's for me, that's something that's really important, is that this technology has come from the market. It's come from ingenuity and enterprise. It's been something that has been developed. Hon Lik is attributed as being the first pharmacist. He was a Chinese pharmacist who invented the first e-cigarette back in 2003. And he did so because he'd seen the devastating impact that smoking had on his life and the life of his father. And so I think for me, that's something that's terrific. It's that we've got a product that people can choose to use if they're a current adult smoker, and it's going to be less harmful for them than continuing to smoke.
And so, okay, you've outlined e-cigarettes. What are the other alternatives that harm reduction approaches have led us to? What's from a market perspective? What are those alternatives that have emerged?
Well, there's a whole range of products now that are available. So I think most people are somewhat familiar with electronic cigarettes or e-cigarettes, which are a battery unit that heat up a liquid that contains nicotine that's inhaled by the user. Some of the other products that are out there are, for instance, you've got heated tobacco products, which still contain tobacco, but they heat it rather than burning it. In Sweden, there's a product called snus, which is like a fermented tobacco product. That's something that's going to be relatively unfamiliar to anyone in Australia, but if you're in Scandinavia, that's something you'd be very familiar with because it's been in use there for more than 100 years. And what all of these products have in common is that they don't involve combustion. And the reason that that's important is because if you look at where most of the harm comes from when it comes to tobacco-related disease, it comes from combustion. And the reason for that is because when you burn something, when you light something on fire, that process creates a whole range of chemicals. And when we're talking about cigarette smoke there, we're talking about around 6,000 chemicals. Some of which are some of the cancer-causing and other harmful chemicals that we know are associated with lung disease and heart disease and a whole range of other smoking-related illnesses.
So how do we know that these work? I mean, it's all well and good for us to say, look, this all sounds like perhaps a better alternative, but in what way can we be sure that these alternatives are in fact better for consumers and ultimately for society, economies, and so on?
Well, we can be sure about it because we look at the evidence and we make up our minds based on the evidence. We know, of course, from a lot of the data where a lot of the harm has come from. So there's a few things that I talk about. One is the problem with burning. So that idea that most of the harm comes from lighting something on fire and inhaling the byproduct of that into your lungs. Two is the role of nicotine. So nicotine is something that's common amongst the whole range of product categories that we've talked about today. So combustible cigarettes, yes, they contain nicotine. It's also true that smoke-free products or reduced risk products, this new category of non-combustible alternatives, they contain nicotine too. And the way that it's been put by some is that smokers smoke for the nicotine, but they die from the smoke. And so that's really the concept that's right at the heart of tobacco harm reduction, and why it is that we're trying as quickly as possible to switch people, if they're going to continue smoking, from more harmful combustible tobacco products to less harmful non-combusted alternatives or smoke-free products. But there's a whole range of those products, and snus, as I mentioned, is a bit of a strange one, but it's actually a really good example because it gives us a proof of concept. One of the things that people talk about is, well, we don't have long-term data for electronic cigarettes, and that's true. But in terms of a proof of concept, Swedish snus is so great because it's been around for 100 years. And it's one of the reasons that epidemiologists can point to say this is the reason why lung cancer rates are so much lower in Sweden than they are in other parts of Europe, where you don't have, where you've still got nicotine consumption happening, but the way that people consume nicotine is unfortunately by lighting tobacco on fire. And so if you can avoid that combustion, then that's really where you avoid a lot of the harm.
And so, okay, so traditionally what we've done, we've had quit smoking campaigns through awareness and so on. We've had everyone be familiar with the packaging, with the eye, all this sort of
Health.
stuff. We saw
Yep.
plain packaging. We've seen taxation to the roof. Uh, why? Maybe we just haven't gone hard enough, don't we? Maybe we just need to double down. If we just tax it a little bit more, or if we just had one more eyeball on the container, how do we know that going hard on the regulation, how do we know that that wouldn't work?
Yes, well, it's a good question. Maybe they could whack another 12.5% tax increase on combustible tobacco, like they have for a number of years. And I think one of the things to say about that is there are some unintended consequences of some of those regulations. So while it's true that they would have reduced tobacco consumption, I think there's no doubt about the fact that we have seen reductions as a result of some of those tobacco control policies. I think one of the things that we've seen in the last few years, particularly in Australia, is that we're reaching a point where we may have maxed out the potential for some of those policies. And the reason I say that is because one of the issues that we've seen in Australia over the last few years is a significant increase in the illicit tobacco market. So what that is either tobacco that's grown here in Australia or it's grown overseas. It comes in shipping containers from overseas. It may be diverted from legal markets. So you might have, for example, tobacco that's sold in other markets around the world where taxes aren't as high. And where you can purchase those products and bring them in illegally into the Australian market and sell them at a significant markup. So the rate of consumption in that part of the market is about 20%. So I think that probably would surprise a lot of people, and I think one of the reasons for that is because of taxes. I think that's undeniable that if you increase artificially the price of something, if people continue to demand that product, then they're going to find other ways of trying to get access to it. So I think that's one of the reasons why I think we've probably maxed out where we can go, particularly on taxes. And I also think there's a really significant equity issue here too. So broadly, the cohort of people in Australia who continue to smoke are at the lower socioeconomic end of the spectrum. And so if the policy response to smoking is going to be, well, let's increase tobacco taxes, then the people you're increasing that tax burden on are at the lower end of the income scale. And so I think that's something that policymakers ought to have at the back of their mind when they're considering whether to increase tobacco taxes. There are other taxes also that apply at the lower end of the income scale, and there's pretty good reasons why we're cautious about that sort of policy response. So I think that's a reasonable thing to take that equity argument into account, because we don't see these sort of tax increases on some of the products that some of the policymakers themselves might like to consume. We don't see 12.5% tax increases year on year on red wine, for example. But I think that's one of the things that I'm a little bit cautious of, because we've seen this explosion in the black market where we've got 20% of products being sold in the black market. And even if they are still buying cigarettes legally, they're doing so in a much more expensive way than they were 10 years ago. And we're talking about a cohort of people who are at the lower end of the income scale.
And so, obviously many countries are confronted with challenges related to tobacco use and other drugs. But are we on the same sort of track? Are we doing the same sort of things as other countries, or are there good examples out there that you'd point us to?
Well, when it comes to tobacco harm reduction, I think it's fair to say that Australia's a long way behind the rest of the world. It was only last year that there was a new regulation that was put in place which regulated e-cigarettes and other nicotine-containing smoke-free products as smoking cessation therapies. So they're now regulated as prescription medicines in a similar sort of way to the way that other prescription medicines are regulated. But this is after years and years of people choosing to use e-cigarettes as a means of either reducing their tobacco consumption or completely stopping to smoke entirely. So I think there are a few jurisdictions I'd point to, and one of them is right on our doorstep, and that is in New Zealand. Where in New Zealand there's a smoke-free act in New Zealand which regulates nicotine-containing e-cigarettes as consumer goods. They're adult consumer goods. They're age restricted. There's a number of restrictions when it comes to the sorts of ingredients and flavors and packaging and advertising. But I think that that's a much more sensible approach than the one we have here, because I think it recognises, the New Zealand Ministry of Health has recognised that they have significantly high smoking rates in certain communities. And in order to tackle those, we need new ways of dealing with those problems. And if we can have vaping as a tool in the toolbox to help people to stop smoking, then why not embrace that?
And so, just for those that may be following this, that don't closely follow the way that vaping is regulated, in what ways does that differ from how cigarettes are regulated in Australia?
Well, in Australia, of course, cigarettes are regulated as consumer goods. They're heavily regulated, but they're regulated as consumer goods, and so that's why you can go to your local convenience store or supermarket or tobacconist and buy a packet of cigarettes if you're over the age of 18. There are all sorts of regulations to do with the way that those products are manufactured, the way that they're presented, advertising and marketing restrictions, which have come in over the last few years. But I think the key difference in the Australian context between these two product categories is you've got a very heavily regulated consumer product on the combustible side. But then when it comes to people switching from a combustible product, which we know is harmful, to a less harmful product in the form of e-cigarettes, we've put arguably we've got higher barriers to entry for that market. So we're making it more difficult for people to switch to the less harmful product. So I think from a regulatory point of view, what we're missing here in Australia is a risk proportionate analysis when it comes to regulation. It doesn't make sense to put more regulations on the less harmful product than it does the more harmful product. So the way that I look at it from a regulatory point of view is to say, well, let's apply a risk proportionate lens to this, which I think is one of the reasons why New Zealand has gone the way that they have. And New Zealand's not the only country to do this. The US has a pathway where the Food and Drug Administration assesses product on the basis of the evidence. The company I work for, Philip Morris, made an application to the Food and Drug Administration in 2018 for our leading smoke-free product, and in 2020 we received an authorization for that product to be allowed to sell it in the US. And in the US, they have a very high standard to allow new products onto the market. The standard that you have to meet is whether it's of benefit to the public health. That's the core deciding factor about whether they'll authorize a new product in the US. And through evidence, we were able to show that we with our product met that standard. You could have a similar regulatory regime in Australia, and it would still allow for regulators to have a very high degree of control over new products coming onto the market. But it would also mean that you recognise that there's harm reduction potential for adults who switch from combustible tobacco to less harmful alternatives.
So out of the suite of regulations, which one is the least useful or the most useless? Is it plain packaging? Is it the tax? What is the one that's least responsive to regulation?
It's a good question, but it's a very difficult one to assess. And one of the reasons it's difficult to assess in the Australian context is because we introduced plain packaging in Australia at the same time as we introduced tax increases. So in terms of the policy experiment we're running in the real world in Australia, we added what you might call a confounding variable. So it starts making it very difficult to make an assessment about, well, I mean, in the year immediately following the introduction of plain packaging, this is not something that's talked about too much in Australia in the context of the public health lobby, but consumption actually increased in that year. So So there's some strange things going on, and partly that's because human behaviour is complex, and a lot of the time it's more complex than policymakers might want to admit. But I think it's true to say that there's a number of things that are going on. I would say overall, a contribution has been made by each of those policies to a reducing in the overall smoking rate in Australia. But I think that if you go back to some of the recent data, some of the Australian authorities are talking about there being, over the last few years, a sort of plateauing of the smoking rate. So while we're plateauing, an interesting comparison to make is, well, what's happening in other jurisdictions? And in jurisdictions like Japan and the US and New Zealand and certainly the UK, you've got significantly accelerated declines in the smoking rate. And a big part of the reason for that is that they have got more liberal regulatory regimes on less harmful non-combusted alternative products. So I think that that's quite instructive for us. It's quite instructive for policymakers to look at what's happening in jurisdictions overseas and to learn from what has happened in those jurisdictions where smoking rates are declining more rapidly.
And so, I mean, on plain packaging, you've kind of alluded to this already, but it seems fairly arbitrary that we choose to plain package cigarettes, but not other products that it may also be harmful to us. I mean, what if we're going to have plain packaged cigarettes? Why not clean skin wines only?
Yeah, well, I've sometimes joked with some of my friends in the policy making space that we should be careful not to give too many ideas to people that might actually want to implement them. But I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, if a proposal like that was to start gaining traction over the next few years, I wouldn't be surprised, because I think one of the trends that we see in policy is that some of the ideas that we apply to tobacco might be the first area where we apply a policy, but then as time moves on, some of those policies pop up in other areas too. So we might see it, for example, there's been discussion about a sugar tax in Australia. That's something that has gained traction over the last few years, and so I do wonder sometimes whether some of these policies, including plain packaging, might sometimes might one day appear in fast food or alcohol or in other areas, because I think that one of the things that we have as an advantage when it comes to smoking is that we actually have less harmful products available for people to switch to. And I think one of the things that we're starting to see in some of those other industries is, for alcohol, we've got alcohol-free beer and alcohol-free spirits now. And I think that's in response to market demand. People are more concerned about their health and health outcomes than they have been in the past. And so they're looking to switch to those sorts of products. So I think that's the market sort of trying to get ahead of some of those regulatory imposts, but it's also in response to people demanding that sort of more healthy food and drink, etc.
So I guess succinctly, then you're effectively saying that riding the change in demand is the way that you can move the sector forward, rather than trying to make demand decisions for consumers. Would that be
Well,
right?
I think they're doing it. They're doing it anyway. I mean, Australia is a great example of this. Just despite the fact that we only had a regulatory regime for smoke-free products at the end of last year, 500,000 people in Australia have stopped smoking and have switched to e-cigarettes. So we've already got people choosing to do this. They're way ahead of the regulations, and that's always going to be the case, I think. But they're making that choice for themselves, and they've made that choice. They've made that choice on the basis of a whole range of decisions. But those decisions that they're making are individual decisions. And I think that one of the things that we should look at in Australia is, well, how is it that we can try and enhance some of the positive things that have come from the decisions that people have made on an individual basis, and how can we best encourage that through policy making?
So one of the criticisms you get in the harm reduction space is that whether it's tobacco or any other drug, that if you're pro harm reduction, you are therefore pro use of product. Is it not? Is harm reduction just pro user more than pro drug?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's just accepting that that people are consuming a product which may be harmful for them. It accepts that while we might have a whole range of policies in place, you're never going to get to a point where you have no people anywhere consuming nicotine and other drugs. So it's really about accepting people and taking people as they are. And I think really that's the heart of it. At the end of the day, we can have a prohibitionist policy in place, but we've seen what the impact of that can be. And in Australia, when it comes to tobacco harm reduction, the impact of that is an exploding black market. So there's all sorts of negatives that flow from that. It's not just about product quality. It's about the kind of people that are bringing these products into Australia, where that money is going. It's making its way into criminal gangs and organised crime. There's all sorts of very shady players playing in that space, and they're doing it because they see a market opportunity. So I think really what it's about is can we innovate in a way that we can produce a less harmful product, and how is it that the policy system can encourage people to switch to those less harmful alternatives?
Can I get you to put more of a politics lens on for a sec? And more than most issues, right? Harm reduction seems to be one of those ones that seems to mess with left-right political divides. It's not kind of a left-wing issue, right-wing issue. I feel the very reasonable people come to different conclusions. But what is it that kind of breaks the political divide when it comes to this issue?
It's a really interesting question. I think one of the things that I've found is that people approach some of these issues with a different ideological lens. And I think for some people, harm reduction is going to be something where they hear the term and they feel like it's not something that sits well with them. There are going to be others for whom harm reduction is a completely natural concept and something that they've seen when it comes to heroin addiction and methadone. They've seen it when it comes to other forms of drug use, for example, and they're happy to apply that then to nicotine and to smoking. But I think there's also an element of other ideological lenses that people use to try and make sense of some of these policy areas. And for a lot of people in Australia too, it's a matter of choice. They like the idea that they have a choice between products that are on the market. I think ideologically it is an interesting one, but I really think people, for the most part, are looking at it through a lens that they're comfortable with. But the other thing that makes a difference too is the drug that you're talking about. So people will feel very differently about harm reduction when it comes to cannabis has been in the news over the last few days. I always find it really interesting when people talk about their pro legalization when it comes to cannabis, or their pro harm reduction when it comes to cannabis. But they'll take a totally different view when it comes to tobacco and nicotine. That to me, I have to say, I can't quite get my head around that one from a scientific perspective. But I think that those sorts of issues are ones that are really interesting from a policy perspective. But it certainly is an interesting area, because you've always got people who you're surprised by that are either pro or anti tobacco harm reduction. But for me, it's about the evidence. I think the evidence is very clear. It's growing and has been growing now for more than 10 years. We're 15 years down the track almost next year, 20 years next year. So the evidence is consistently growing about the role that non-combusted alternatives can play. And after many years of government agencies talking about the fact that we're talking about around a 95% reduction in risk, I think it's clear from a policy making perspective. So we've just got to keep making sure we get the evidence out there, getting the science out there, so that policymakers can make sensible decisions.
Look, we're just about out of time, Simon, but a final one for you. What regulations would need to be dropped for us to see improved outcomes? And what outcomes do you think we could see from a harm reduction approach?
Well, I think that the best thing we could do is look to New Zealand. New Zealand is a country that we see ourselves in. A lot of the time we make comparisons between Australia and New Zealand. Some of them favourable, some of them not so favourable, but certainly I think it's somewhere we can look to and look to learn from, because they have gone down a very sensible path of regulating non-combustible alternatives, e-cigarettes, as being a less harmful alternative to cigarettes. They're encouraging adult smokers who continue to smoke to switch if they don't quit, and so. To me, that's somewhere we should be looking. The UK has vape shops being opened in NHS hospitals, so we can almost look anywhere around the world and see a more sensible policy on this. But I think New Zealand is the best place to look to and has probably the best regime.
Off to New Zealand we go for a field trip.
Sounds good.
Simon, that's all we've got time for. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Glenn. Pleasure.
And that was episode 95 of On Liberty. Next time, join us where we'll have Salvatore back in the seat, and he'll be joined by Eliza Owen, Head of Residential Research at CoreLogic. Hope to see you then, and see you at CIS again soon. Bye for now.